But really what I realized is that if I can show my chinks in the armor, if I can show my vulnerabilities, my insecurities, and things that I'm still working on, which believe me, my friends, there are many and they're vast. What I do is I open up a human connection, because guess what? If you're listening to this, you're not perfect. You are flawed. Okay, and when I share my imperfections and my vulnerabilities, it actually creates a more of a humanistic touch. And to kind of put a bow on this particular aspect, we'll use an example that we can all understand: Superman. Superman is the most boring character in the history of comic books, in the history of the world, without kryptonite. It's only when kryptonite is introduced is when the story becomes interesting. And then you can actually connect with Superman on that level. And B taught me that. And I'm super grateful for that.
Welcome to the Fitness CEO Podcast, a show dedicated to helping fitness entrepreneurs launch and grow successful gyms. Here's your host, Bryce Henson.
All right, moving along, and I got a few minutes left with you for today, but next thing is top 3 things I've learned from B. That was a great question Matt asked me. So number 1, I would say marketing is the number 1 skill of influence. And he said this to me one time, and he's like, Bryce, I'll never forget this actually. He's like, Bryce, the problem is most fitness business owners, they think they are the CEO first and a marketer second. And that is just such wrong and bad thinking if you really want to scale and grow a profitable business, whether it be a local Fit Body Bootcamp or a massive organization. As the leader of the business, you have to understand you are the chief marketing officer first and foremost, and you're a CEO second. Your job needs to be able to market your business and to be able to, from a leadership perspective, bring on other people that can fill the gap. So from that perspective, seeing B's incredible influence, and then catching a lot of lessons throughout the way, that is definitely number 1. Marketing is number 1 in the priority list. Number 2, vulnerability creates connection. And I'll never forget, when I first met B and started seeing him on stages, this was in 2012 and 2013, I found it very interesting. He talked about his problems. He talked about his insecurities, his issues, his vulnerabilities, coming from escaping communist, the Soviet Union, and arriving in Southern California, living in Section 8 housing, and having gasoline poured in his hair from his mom, who wanted to cure his head for lice, but they didn't have any money. And I thought to myself, that is crazy that he's actually sharing all these things. But the weirdest thing is, I feel more connected. And that is so true. In fact, after delivering this live interview, a dear friend of mine, her name's Courtney, she's the owner of a Fit Body Bootcamp actually in Fayetteville, Georgia. I'm going to give you a shout out, Courtney, if you're watching this. She comes up to me afterwards, and with Barrett and Matt, she's like, I feel you're like my brother. And interestingly, we have a very interesting and similar backstory. There's a lot of very, very strong nuances and similarities. But I think the biggest thing that she thought that, the reason I should say, is because my willingness to share my vulnerabilities, my challenges, my suffer with alcoholism and being a drug addict, and just a lot of challenges that we all face. And to realize that for the longest period of time, I thought, and I still fight it to this day, that I gotta be here and present myself in those perfect fashion and, from that optics. And that's important. You have to have professionalism. You have to look the part. You have to be prepared. These are all things that we talked about, okay? And we'll continue to teach. But really what I realized is that if I can show my chinks in the armor, if I can show my vulnerabilities, my insecurities, and things that I'm still working on, which believe me, my friends, there are many and they're vast. What I do is I open up a human connection, because guess what? If you're listening to this, you're not perfect. You are flawed. Okay, and when I share my imperfections and my vulnerabilities, it actually creates a more of a humanistic touch. And to kind of put a bow on this particular aspect, we'll use an example that we can all understand: Superman. Superman is the most boring character in the history of comic books, in the history of the world, without kryptonite. It's only when kryptonite is introduced is when the story becomes interesting. And then you can actually connect with Superman on that level. And B taught me that. And I'm super grateful for that. My last bullet point is that I admire B is to stand up for what you believe. Whether you love him, whether you hate him, you're not just going to tolerate him. He says what he thinks, and he thinks what he says, and he'll get on his pulpit for that. And I'll give you some very granular example of this. When the COVID-19 pandemic came down. And by the way, this should never have been political, and I don't mean to get political here because I'm not. This is a medical issue where the vision here is to be able to spread health and wellness, inspire fitness, and change lives every day, which is the mission of this particular podcast. But interesting, all the restrictions that basically inhibited our franchise partners to run their business and be able to offer good advice. In fact, the advice of lock yourself and stay in place is the exact opposite from a health and fitness perspective, and especially as the data is showing now a couple years in advance. But interestingly enough, from the very beginning, B would start a hit on this, and he'd been to communist, he'd lived through communism. And while I agreed on a lot of things, if I'm being very honest with you, there were some of them I wasn't totally sure, especially at that period of time. But there B was basically standing his pulpit and then standing up for what he believed in. And I just have a lot of admiration. And whether you agree with him, whether you don't agree with him, that's actually irrelevant. The principle that I really want to take and showcase and provide you a takeaway is you need to stand up for what you believe. And I'd like to credit myself. I do that. But there's an opportunity for myself and you to continue to do that at a higher fashion. So that would be the bow and the top 3 things I learned from our man B. Hey, my friend, hopefully you love that short teaser of the recent episode on the Fitness CEO podcast. To check out the full episode, it will be dropping shortly. But in the meantime, there's some other episodes around here that you need to see.